Lois. Sorry, I have to duck out of the so just so
yeah, no worries. I won't be offended. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're okay to miss that. Jokes, conversation.
Hey, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. As usual, we'd like to acknowledge that we're holding this seminar on Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. And I have the pleasure today of introducing Lois Baker, who's from the University of Edinburgh. Lois did her PhD at Imperial in London, and during that time was office mates with one of our current postdocs, Lizzie Ellison. And then post PhD, she went on to take up a fellowship from the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council at the University of Edinburgh, where she is now. And she's going to tell us about some subjects that are very close to my heart, and I hope will be exciting and enjoyable for all of you. So over to you, Lois.
Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, thank you very much for having me here as a visitor. So yeah, I'm going to talk about I'm going to give a kind of broad overview of kind of ocean dynamics leading up to internal waves, which I'm mostly interested in. And then give a bit of a kind of whistle-stop tour of some of the challenges associated with understanding internal waves and how they can be represented in climate models before kind of moving on to some more recent work. So I guess I'm saying I'm going to present a lot of different things, and hopefully it's not too confusing. But to start off with the big picture. So when we think about the ocean, we're thinking about physics across a huge range of scales. So ocean dynamics vary on scales that kind of really matter, vary over around 8 orders of magnitude in space. So in this beautiful movie, which hopefully you can see is moving, you can see just some of those scales. So for example, the colors show the sea surface temperature, which you can see varies on a global scale. You can see some beautiful currents like equatorial currents and western boundary currents varying on kind of a basin scale. And you can hopefully see the mesoscale eddies being formed in these currents. For example, some Agulhas rings being flung off South Africa. So you can see that we have these smaller mesoscales. And then you won't be able to see, but we can go down to much smaller scales to submesoscales, all the way down to turbulence at centimeter scales. So studying this problem as a whole is very difficult for that reason, because you have to consider all of these scales. So to formalize that, if we can put them all on kind of a space-time diagram, if we start at the planetary scale, we're thinking about processes like basin scale currents, like those western boundary currents and equatorial jets, the meridional overturning circulation, which I'll talk a bit more about later. We move down to the mesoscale. So in the ocean, this is around kind of 100 kilometers or so. And these are the kind of oceanic equivalent of atmospheric weather systems. So we have mesoscale eddies there. On the submesoscale, so this is around kind of 1 to 10 kilometers in the ocean. And here we have some fronts and submesoscale vortices. We sometimes refer to this as kind of submesoscale soup because it's really complicated. And then we move down further, we get to the microscale. So here we have things like ice-ocean interactions, surface waves, things that are really important, but you're definitely not going to resolve in climate models. And then all the way down to stratified turbulence, which is turbulence that knows about the density stratification of the ocean, and 3D isotropic turbulence really at centimeter and millimeter scales. So what governs the dynamics of these processes? And of course, we know that they're all really governed by this one equation, which is pretty fascinating. So this is the Navier-Stokes equation for horizontal momentum that I'm showing. And when we study processes at different scales, we think about different terms in the equation. So we have the material derivative of velocity here. We have the Coriolis term, so F is the Earth's rotation, the pressure gradient, and a friction term for viscous dissipation. And so when we are, when we're looking at these large scales, so planetary, mesoscale, maybe part of the submesoscale, rotation is dominating, and we have what we call geostrophic balance between Coriolis and pressure gradients. And what that means is that the dynamics are kind of quasi 2D. So you can think of this almost as a 2D fluid. At the other end of the scale, these processes don't really know about the Earth's rotation, so we can forget about Coriolis and solve the kind of regular equations in a non-rotating frame. And obviously in the middle, things are more complex still. So if we have all of these scales, we then have to think about how energy transfers across the scales. And so in the ocean, most of the energy input is at the very large scales. So we have solar, heating, wind forcing, tidal forcing, all kind of coming in at the planetary scale. And then if we think about how energy exits the ocean, we have some kind of energy exit at intermediate scales, for example, kind of friction between eddies in the atmosphere. But mostly we have energy coming out really at these very small scales. So we have boundary friction, irreversible mixing of momentum or dissipation, and this is where energy is lost to heat at very small scales, or irreversible mixing of buoyancy, which we call diapycnal mixing, where diapycnal is cross-density surface, and that's where you do work against gravity. So then you really have energy coming in at the very large scales, exiting at the very small scales, so what happens in between? And again, we're looking at this from the perspective of how do we represent that in models. And of course, this dissipation and diapycnal mixing at the very small scales really feeds back onto the large scale flow. So really you have to care about the centimeter scales in order to understand the global scales. And one of the main reasons for this is when we're thinking about the buoyancy budget of the ocean and the meridional overturning circulation. So you've probably heard of the meridional overturning circulation or the thermohaline circulation or the oceanic conveyor belts. But these are observations actually, but this is a slice through the Atlantic I'm showing. This is quite a famous schematic. So down on the left here, this is Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. And on the right, this is the North Atlantic. And so this is the symmetry in black. And you can see these overturning cells, which are kind of look very nice in 2D. In reality, they're not at all 2D. But you can see that we have sinking of waters at the poles. So this is Antarctic bottom water being formed, becoming really dense around Antarctica, sinking down to the bottom of the ocean and then kind of creeping up northwards. And then we have North Atlantic deep waters being formed up in the North Atlantic, and convection causes them to sink. And you get these overturning large-scale cells. And the color here is oxygen. And oxygen is really being used here to show the age of the water. So the longer it's been since the waters were ventilated at the ocean surface, the less oxygen they have. So what you can see here is that you have very kind of young waters down really deep in the Southern Ocean, and that's because they've just recently sunk down from the surface. Okay, but what I want to highlight here is that if you have waters sinking and becoming very dense around Antarctica, and then they're sort of coming up northward, how are those waters going to get back to the surface? Because they're very, very dense. That's why they're down here. And if they don't somehow get lighter, then the ocean is just going to fill up with dense waters from the bottom, and it's not going to be in a steady state. So then how does that water make its way back up to the surface? And the way it does that is through turbulent mixing and some other processes like wind-driven upwelling. But what it really needs to do is mix with waters above it in order to get lighter. And that's what's demonstrated here by these little wiggly arrows. And in black here is shown the mean depth of the mid-Atlantic ridge. So what this is demonstrating is that around the depth of topography, you need this mixing in order for these waters in the bottom cell to kind of make their way to the upper cell so that they can eventually upwell. Okay, so it's this mixing around topography which is helping to close the overturning circulation. And so that's one of the main reasons that we care about this mixing is so that we can understand the large-scale buoyancy budget of the ocean. Because, for example, if you have a lot of heat uptake in the Southern Ocean from anthropogenic heat, and then it gets stored in the abyssal ocean, you want to know when that heat is going to ventilate again, on maybe centuries or millennia. So this is why we care about diapycnal mixing. So then we want to understand how much diapycnal mixing we get. So we need to understand how energy cascades from the large to the small scales. And so at the kind of first step, this is how we get from basin scale currents down to the mesoscale. And this is due to baroclinic instability. And this is something we understand quite well. But what's interesting here is that when you have the mesoscale, this is, as I said, kind of quasi 2D. And what happens in 2D turbulence is that things get bigger rather than smaller. So actually, you have an inverse cascade here. So the mesoscale kind of wants to get bigger, even though it's kind of the large scales are going unstable and creating a mesoscale. So this doesn't really help us much with how energy fluxes downscale. At this end of the diagram, we have a more kind of 3D picture. So we have sort of maybe convective instabilities, stratified turbulence, a 3D turbulent cascade. So in 3D, turbulence actually wants to get smaller, so scales get smaller. And this is where you have a forward cascade. And then in the middle, it's a bit more complicated. So does energy flux upscale or downscale? We have things like turbulent bottom drags, submesoscale instabilities, and it's a bit less clear what's happening. But what I really want to talk about is internal waves. So internal waves are one of the main mechanisms through which energy can get kind of from the large scale, so from the mesoscale, from the tides, all the way down to turbulent scales through wave breaking. So it's like a little shortcut on this cascade. So very quickly, I'll explain what internal gravity waves are. So we all know that on the surface of the ocean, because of the difference in density between air and water, we have surface gravity waves. Well, the ocean is not obviously all one density. So if you imagine it as a two-layer fluid, you can imagine that you'd get waves on the interface through denser water and lighter water above. And these are internal gravity waves. But in fact, the ocean is not two layers. It's actually continuously stratified. Let's see if that works. There we go. So the ocean is mostly continuously stratified, and that's stratified by temperature and by salt, of course. And so in the interior, we have these internal gravity waves living on that stratification, and the ocean is full of them. And so we have this buoyancy frequency n, which is the vertical gradient of buoyancy, and that sort of quantifies how fast stuff oscillates because of the stratification. Now, the ocean is obviously also rotating, and these waves are much bigger than the surface gravity waves, much larger displacements, much larger horizontal and vertical wavelengths. So they can really feel rotation as well, some of them, the larger ones. So we also care about this other frequency, which is the Coriolis frequency, so the rate of Earth's rotation. And so internal wave frequency, omega, is kind of constrained to be between F, the Coriolis frequency, and N, the stratification. And I'll come back to that later. Okay, so here we have these kind of internal waves and some other kinds of waves added onto this diagram. So we have things like barotropic tides, so that's the depth independent tide, inertial oscillations, internal tides, lee waves, near inertial waves, all sorts filling the ocean. And as I've tried to highlight, these are important in the interior and the deep ocean for mixing because they can break just like waves on the surface can. Okay, so everyone who studies internal waves likes to show this schematic in their seminars. So this is a nice schematic of internal wave-driven mixing by McKinnon et al. And it shows the different kind of internal waves that you get in the ocean. And they're usually generated at the boundaries of the ocean. So for example, if you have a storm blowing over the ocean surface, that's going to generate inertial oscillations in the mixed layer. And that can send near inertial waves propagating down into the ocean interior. And then also when you have flows interacting with bottom topography, this is when you get topographically generated internal waves, which is what I'll be mostly talking about from now on. So when you have oscillating flows over topography, so such as tides, this is when you get internal tides, so either high modes or low modes. And when you have kind of steady currents going over topography, this is when you get Lee waves, which are kind of steady phase-locked waves. And Lee waves, for example, also exist in the atmosphere, and they're much more easy to visualize in the atmosphere. So this is a picture of the Adriatic Sea. And you can see that these waves are being kind of highlighted by the cloud here. So wind blows over a mountain and generates these internal waves. And when these waves break, you might get turbulence like you feel in an aeroplane. So we'll focus on these topographically generated ones now in the ocean. And then just a final bit of motivation. This is an observational study. So this is in the Brazil basin. And what they're measuring is diffusivity, so basically mixing in the ocean. And you can see that over this kind of really flat part of the basin, this topography, you have very low diffusivity. And over this very rough topography, you have very high diffusivity. And this is because of those topographic interactions generating small-scale dynamics, such as waves, which then break and mix, contributing to water mass transformation. Okay, so most internal waves are not resolved in global ocean models, and certainly not in our coupled climate models. So to represent their effect, representing their effect on the energy and the buoyancy budgets of the ocean through their dissipation and mixing effect, and also drag and so on, is really important for getting climate models right. So we need to parameterize them. So we use physics-informed parameterizations of internal waves, which we derive from theory and also from wave-resolving numerical models. And observations of these waves do exist, of course, but particularly for Lee waves, which are these kind of steady ones, are very sparse. So it's quite a difficult problem. So here's an example for it, which I guess I'll come back to, of sort of realistic models of Lee waves, theoretical models, and then we'll use that information to plug into our parameterizations. So approaches to doing this, to representing their effects, we start with linear theory, and I love linear theory. Okay, so it's nice and easy. You will know what linear theory is, but essentially you just assume that your flow is some mean part and some wave part. You assume the wave part is much smaller than the mean part. You expand with some wave ansatz, and you neglect quadratic terms. That's very basic linear theory. And it works really well when studying internal waves, surprisingly well. So here's an example of how you might parameterize Lee waves. So what you want to do is estimate their generation rate globally, for example. And the ingredients you need to do that, the things you need to plug into your linear theory, are the bottom velocity and the bottom stratification. And these things you can get from a climate model, from an observation, however you like. And then you also need to know the bottom topography, because this is what really generates the waves. So ideally, you'd like to know the topographic height h as a function of x and y. And for that, you need topographic data, which I'll come back to. And then you plug these things into your linear theory to find some Lee wave energy flux. And this is what's shown in this figure, which is reproduced from a study by Nick and Ferrari, where they did just this using global data sets and calculated the energy flux. So here you can see that you have this really high band of Lee wave generation around the Antarctic circumpolar current, in particular in the Drake Passage. That's where you have very fast bottom velocities and very rough topography generating a whole bunch of waves. So once you know that, once you know how the waves are generated, then you have to kind of say, well, where is that energy then going to be dissipated? And so you might assume that that energy kind of decays exponentially from the seafloor. You might use some empirical decay scale. You might use a much smarter method. Obviously, there's been lots of studies doing this. And then you might convert your energy flux to a dissipation rate, infer a corresponding vertical diffusivity, so this mixing, and that comes in here. This is kappa, the diffusivity, and you could plug that into your numerical model. So that's kind of the basics of how you might start to parameterize these things. So this, for example, would be your buoyancy equation with some turbulent diffusivity. Okay, but some challenges when doing this. Okay, so the first one is actually just the availability of topographic data. And I always find this one really interesting. So ocean bathymetry isn't mapped at sufficient resolution for wave generation, at least lee wave generation. So that resolution would be maybe a kilometer. And we only really have bathymetry at that resolution where a ship has physically gone and done a multi-beam survey. And so I'm not sure if you can see this on the projector, but I always like going on Google Maps, which actually has a very up-to-date bathymetry. And you can see like the ocean floor looks really funny because some patches are really rough, like here. This is very like corrugated. We call this abyssal hill bathymetry. Sorry if it's not showing up that well. And then some areas are much smoother. And this is where the bathymetry is inferred from satellite altimetry and has maybe a resolution of around 10 kilometers or something. So actually, we don't really have the ocean bathymetry at the resolution we like. And so the workaround that people usually use is by assuming a kind of spectral form for these abyssal hills at the scales that you don't know. So there's a spectrum that people usually use. But then you're missing out, for example, maybe on things like seamounts, if you're just using your abyssal hills. So that's one of the challenges. And then this is something I found which is really cool. If it happens, this is a project called Seabed 2030. Some people here might know more about this than me, but they're like trying to collect lots of bathymetry data with a very high aim of having like 72.6% of the world ocean floor deep, shallower than like 6,000 meters mapped, which seems very ambitious, but like really cool if it happens. So I just want to highlight that. Okay, so so the availability of topographic data. And then the second challenge I want to talk about is the fact that these flows are not always linear. So we're applying our linear theory, but when you have very steep and tall topography, you're going to have nonlinearities, and how do you deal with that? So as a kind of case study, we looked at how linear theory does in this patch of the Southern Ocean in the Drake Passage, which is a real hotspot for lee wave generation, as I showed here earlier. And so we wanted to see how these linear parameterizations do on this very nonlinear topography, comparing them to a realistic model. So this is the model. It's run using MIT-GCM. It's nested within this larger Southern Ocean patch. It's this little domain here. And it's got a fairly realistic bathymetry because ships like going to the Drake Passage and doing science, so there's quite good bathymetry data. It resolves quite a lot of internal waves, probably not all of them. And it's nonlinear, of course. So the idea is to compare linear theory with this nonlinear simulation and see if the parameterization works, essentially. Now, for linear theory, we obviously have a small parameter that we need to be small. And that here is the topographic Froude number, which is n, the stratification, times h, the topographic height, over u, the flow velocity. And this looks to some people like an upside down Froude number, but this is the way we use it here. So just for some context, the Froude number is the topographic height over the characteristic vertical wavelength of the waves. So when this is small, you can apply your linear theory, no worries. However, if you calculate that Froude number in this region, you can see there's really rough topography. This is the horizontal velocity being shown here, but you can probably see some of these little waves. These are lee waves being generated from topography and propagating upwards. And if you calculate the Froude number, it's kind of order 100 at these ridges. So how can we go ahead and then apply our linear theory? Well, luckily we can make some modifications to that theory so that we can still linearize. So what we did is we developed this parameterization that represents the effective topography. So actually, if you think of these kind of very tall bumps, and you have a flow moving over these bumps, it's not going to go all the way over. It's actually usually going to get blocked and go round, just kind of from an energetic perspective. It's going to go round. So really the important topography here for wave generation is not the whole thing. It's just this like little effective topography at the top. So what we did is we developed a parameterization to kind of represent these little topographic caps and then use that to estimate the wave generation. And it did surprisingly well. So this is the root mean squared vertical velocity near the bottom in the domain. And that represents the kind of vertical displacement, which is very strongly linked to the Lee wave generation. And so this is from the simulation. This is from our kind of effective topography method. And this is from how you might normally do this, which is using basically taking the Fourier transform of the topography and applying some saturation cutoff. But this is how it's generally done. And you can see, hopefully, that this one matches this one quite a bit better. This one is maybe 50 to 100% larger over the whole domain. And so the flux calculated from the simulated wave field matches our new parameterization well, and also shows that current estimates could be over-predicting the Lee wave energy flux, which is something that has been seen in observations as well. Usually we predict it's much larger than it is. So needless to say, even in these very non-linear locations, we can still apply linear theory quite successfully, which is lucky for me. Okay, so the third thing I want to talk about with linear theory is wave interactions with other dynamics, because waves do not exist in isolation. They interact with other flows in the ocean. So generally, when we calculate the generation of Lee waves like this, I'm specifically talking about Lee waves now, we assume that the waves kind of propagate in an inviscid, infinite depth ocean with a uniform background flow. So we don't account for things like reflections, interactions with a mean flow where the stratification increases with height, for example. So motivated by this simulation, which is from this is the same Drake Passage simulation. So you can see this is the topography along the bottom. I'm showing the vertical velocity field, and it shows really clearly these waves being generated. So they're generated at topography and they propagate upwards. And what you can really clearly see here, even though it's a model, is that they reflect off the surface. So you get some interesting interference patterns. And they also interact very strongly with the background flow. So we thought we'd try and kind of look at that in this linear framework just by including these aspects. So including non-uniform velocity and stratification, including an upper boundary to allow waves to reflect, and including some viscosity so that they kind of decay with height. And so this is the kind of modified linear model. And it's quite interesting, the kind of things that you can infer from this model. So, for example, and this is all kind of stuff that's quite well known, especially in an atmospheric context, the energy flux is modified by interferences with the reflected waves. That's not something we generally take account of. And interaction with the mean flow with critical levels. That's when you have a decreasing flow with height above bottom, and the phase speed matches the flow speed, and you get non-linearities. But here, for example, this is the energy loss from the waves. This is some artificial topography at the bottom. This is when you have a constant mean flow with height above bottom, and this is when, and a constant stratification and some viscosity, which is why they're losing energy. And here's when you, say, increase U and N with height linearly above the bottom, and you can see that the energy flux kind of makes it all the way up to the surface. And so there's just a different distribution within the water column. And so this kind of shows us that there's still an important role for this really quite simple linear physics in understanding how these waves affect the ocean. Because, for example, if you're getting more dissipation in the upper ocean, as opposed to it all dissipating down near topography, that's really going to affect how this mixing shapes the buoyancy budget of the ocean. So, having said that, we can't do everything with linear theory. So now we use generally a lot of wave resolving numerical simulations. And so I'm just going to touch on one aspect of this, which is what I've been working on for the last couple of years or so, which is identifying waves in numerical simulations, which is really something that's easier said than done. So increasingly, we're able to resolve waves in regional numerical simulations, for example, this simulation for Drake Passage. And there's even some global 1 kilometer ocean models that can resolve quite a lot of internal waves. So then how do we actually identify what is a wave when there's so many other complex dynamics with overlapping spatial and temporal scales? So actually looking at just the vertical velocity here, and I will say there's no tides in this model as well, which is quite key. It's actually quite easy to identify what's a wave and what's not. But if I were to show you the vorticity, for example, there's so many kind of surface submesoscales near the bottom. It's really hard to pick out, at least visually, what is a wave and what's not. So this is where we come to Lagrangian versus Eulerian filtering. So as I said, we often have numerical fluid simulations, and generally we want to average or filter them to kind of focus on the dynamics that we care about. So we might want to remove the high frequencies if we care about the mean flow, or we might want to focus on the high frequencies. For example, here I want to identify waves or other high frequency processes. So this is something that we kind of commonly do. And generally, we identify waves as high frequency motions in an Eulerian frame. So what I mean by that is that we sit at a fixed spatial location and we take a time average, for example, or a high passing time. So you can imagine you're sitting at the little pink star. And so for a fixed x, you just take a time average. We probably will do this every day. But internal waves can actually be very strongly Doppler shifted by background flows. So I said earlier that they satisfy this frequency criterion, in particular that they have higher frequency than f. So this is a really good way to define internal waves, but it's actually only the frequency in the frame of the flow that satisfies that frequency criterion. And so we come to Lagrangian filtering, which is when we're averaging in time, but following the flow. So we're sitting on this little yellow star and then filtering following the flow. And this is a good way to pick out waves, which it has been shown previously. So when, for example, could this be useful? My motivation for this is because I've been studying Lie waves, and that's a canonical example of when you need to do this. So if you think about Lie waves, which are steady, so you have some steady flow, topography is steady, of course, it generates a steady wave field. They have an intrinsic frequency u dot k, where k is the horizontal wave number. So if you were to take an Eulerian mean of this to find the mean flow, you'd find exactly the flow you started with because they're steady. Is if you were to take a Lagrangian mean and filter out this intrinsic frequency, then you'd lose the waves. You'd find your mean flow, and you'd also then be able to define your wave-like flow. So generally, when people do Lagrangian filtering, they use particle tracking. And so there's this awesome open source package written by people in the room for doing Lagrangian filtering using particle tracking. And you can do that either online, so during your simulation. So that means you don't have to necessarily output a bunch of data if that's prohibited, or you can do it offline. So you can save all your data and you can run this thing offline as a post-processing step. And that's what's generally been done because it makes sense that Lagrangian analysis is done by following particles. That's kind of what it's all about. But recently my group, so initially Hussein Kafabad, who's at Durham University, and Jacques Bernest, who's at Edinburgh, came up with these new partial differential equation-based methods for Lagrangian filtering. And so I'm not going to go through the maths of that, but essentially it involves defining mathematically what you mean by the field you want to find, taking a time derivative and finding a partial differential equation for that field. So the idea is that instead of tracking particles, you solve partial differential equations for the Lagrangian filtered variables. It's kind of like a continuous analog of particle tracking. But you do this as you would for any other traces in your model. So this can be done again online at simulation time or offline on saved data. And then what's nice about this is that it uses the existing model methods for advecting traces. So if your model can already advect biogeochemical traces, it can advect this tracer, which means that it's quite easy to implement, easy. So this is, well, I don't know, I've been using this code called Oceananigans, which is great. I really want to advertise it. because it's they call it fast and friendly ocean flavored Julia software. And what's really nice about it is it's very accessible. So just to run a script is super easy. It's very good for like teaching and examples. And Julia is kind of really, it's really easy to use as a beginner, I would say. But it runs incredibly fast on GPUs. So that's the main advantage. And here's some examples from the Oceanograms paper that's of different flow configurations they've done. So they've got a global configuration, which is kind of realistic, perhaps not quite where the other kind of global ocean models are yet, but I think obviously it's being worked on. And then you can do your kind of box models and so on. So Oceanograms is really good fun. And so I implemented this Lagrangian filter in Oceanograms in a package with this really catchy name, Oceanograms Lagrangian filter. And so this is basically to make it easy for people running idealized or realistic simulations in Oceanograms to do this Lagrangian filtering. So you can do it online or offline. And the idea is that it's fairly easy to do. But this method is obviously not Oceanograms specific. It's just a bunch of forced advection equations. And so you can implement it in any model that you like. And this is an example of Lee waves in Oceanograms. So this is just a simple flow over a bump. And this is the raw horizontal velocity. So you just see it spinning up. And then the movie gets very boring because it's steady. So this is the horizontal velocity. There's some stratification. The black lines are the diapycnals. You can see it stabilizes pretty quickly. And then this is centered around 0.2, which is just the mean flow. And then if I wanted to Eulerian filter this, it's kind of like a running filter. You can see that it's going to be exactly the same. So this is done, well, it can be done online. This is actually done offline on the simulation data. So as I showed before, these two are going to be the same. And then we can look at the Lagrangian filtered output, and there's some spin up, which I just haven't truncated there, just from finite time cut off at the ends of the interval. And you can see that it removes the waves quite effectively. So what's left here is the mean flow. And you can actually see that these color bars are different. There's like an order of magnitude difference. So it's removed the waves very effectively. That's just the truncation at the end of the interval, not physical. But what you can see here actually is that there's still this remnant of the wave in the mean field. And this is what's quite interesting about Lagrangian filtering, is that we've removed the wave velocity, but the whole field is still being displaced by the wave displacement. And so if you want to remove that, you can do that too by remapping to a mean coordinate. And you can see that the output then is has really truly removed the wave. You have these kind of straight lines. And so you might want to then use this Lagrangian mean field to understand the wave impact on the mean flow, for example, or you might want to use it to determine your wave energy fluxes in a more realistic configuration. So that's a nice idealized one. And so I've been using all these idealized experiments for so long that we thought it would be fun to try and implement it in MOM6. So that's why I'm visiting ANU, just to work with Callum Shakespeare, Angus Gibson, and Lizzie Ellison. And we are implementing this in a regional simulation, which Lizzie has been looking at biogeochemical traces in. So it's the Northwest Shelf. And what we're going to do, / currently doing, is implementing these Lagrangian filter equations to try and understand the internal wave field. Now, oh, that's actually a movie. Okay. So you have very strong tidal flows in this region. The flashing here, this is the barotropic tide, so the depth independent tide. And you also, strong mean flows as well, and lots of internal tide generation. So can we use these methods to then pick out the internal tides? And is that better than just doing your standard time filtering? That's the question. So this again is just the raw, velocity field from Lizzie in a vertical slice. And I'm just showing it so you can see the internal tides. So the kind of large scale flickering, that's the barotropic tide. And then all of these kind of depth independent propagated motions, these are all internal tides which have been generated. For example, I think you can see something being generated here at this mountain. and they're propagating all throughout the domain. So this is what we're interested in. And this is a slightly strange figure, but it kind of demonstrates why Lagrangian filtering is actually really hard. And so what I'm showing here is the kind of the flow distortion of the latitude coordinate. So this is just the latitude being shown on the color bar. And then what you'll see is that as the flow advecs over a period of, I think, 3 days, how much it all mixes up because of the chaotic advection. So you can see, for example, there's immediately a really strong Indonesian through flow here. And then you can see all these kind of swirls being generated by the eddies in the region. And this is what makes this method really difficult, is because you're tracking things that are swirling and mixing up and shearing, which makes this numerically a very difficult thing to do.
Sorry, Lois, is that, you say distortion of the latitude coordinate, is that, you mean over the interval that you're Lagrangianly averaging?
Yeah, so
That
this
is
is,
how far the fluid moves.
yeah, so this is just something I was outputting as kind of a, well, this is kind of like the flow map, actually. It's part of the flow map. So it shows you where a tracer starts, what its final Y position is over an interval. And the interval here is my averaging interval, which is, well, it's half the averaging interval, in fact, about 3 days, yeah. It's just one of the things it's a map that we actually end up using to do some interpolation back to a mean position. And the point is that that's difficult to interpolate because it's very complex. Okay, and then here we have my kind of final result, which is very recent, so don't quiz me too hard on it. But so this is the original zonal velocity in the domain at the surface. And then this is what we get from our Lagrangian filtered code. So it's filtered so it keeps the, it's a high pass, just keeping the semi-diurnal frequency, essentially. And these here are in fact internal tides. This is one wavelength here of an internal tide. And at the shelf region here, you've still got some signal of the barotropic tide that we haven't managed to remove. But this is quite promising because we're definitely filtering for internal tides. What you will notice is this is actually a kind of swirly version of the internal tide field. You can see actually it's kind of been distorted. And that's because we now need to apply an interpolation to bring them back to their original positions. This is the way this analysis is done. It's a detail, but it's quite difficult. And so this is the zonal east-west velocity. So you can see that actually the tides that you pick out in the zonal velocity, they're kind of, well, ones that are propagating west-east. So they're kind of, the crests are aligned this way, north-south. And then if you look at the meridional velocity, you get the internal tides that are propagating in a north-south direction. And so the crests are aligned sort of east-west. So that was quite nice to see. Again, some like barotropic stuff on the shelf. So yeah, the aim is to then use these output fields to understand more about internal tides in regional simulations. And I will summarize that. So I'm not sure, oh, that's quite good timing. So coarse climate and ocean models need parameterizations of internal wave-driven mixing. Linear theory, perhaps with modifications for nonlinear scenarios, is useful. And there's still a lot that we can learn from theory, I think. Nonlinear numerical simulations increasingly resolve waves as we can move to kind of higher resolution using these kind of new GPU-based codes. And we need tools to analyze them, and then we can learn from that to create better parameterizations. So yeah, thank you very much. Any questions?
Okay, questions for Lois, and I'm told afterwards we have Kate as well. We'll start with questions. Gemma.
When you're calculating effective topography in your earlier factorization, how do you know which bit goes over instead of which bit goes around or gets blocked? Is that dependent on flow velocity or stratification?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I can go back to it. Good question. So yes, it depends on the flow velocity and the stratification. Exactly.
So it's time dependent as well.
Yeah, exactly. So what you do is, well, from kind of energetic arguments, you can work out that this effective height is around U over N, which is the same as the internal wave vertical wavelength. So what you do is you define a critical fruit number. And so this would really depend on lots of things, on the shape of your topography, for example, how 3D your topography is. But if you take a critical fruit number of order 1, and then you define your effective height using that. And I think I found in this case, a critical fruit number of 1 matched really, really well. So yeah. Does that make sense?
Does it actually matter how tall your topography is, or you're just cutting everything off the same way?
Yeah, you're just cutting everything off. So I mean, actually in this domain, it kind of really did matter because the tall topography is sticking up higher, so it's experiencing like faster velocities, and so that changes the effective height. But yeah, ultimately no, because the flow just goes around it and doesn't generate waves. No.
Which stratification value do you use?
I think we're just using like a 200 meter above bottom average. So really looking at generation. But I think, yeah, there's some studies show that you should use the whole watercolor stratification as well. But you have to make a choice. Yeah.
And
So if you apply that to the original equation for our estimates, because they just use the linear approximation, right?
With a like a saturation condition, so using a critical fruit number, but using the spectral representation of topography.
Oh, right.
So this is kind of more like what they did, but the estimates match order of magnitude with their estimates. Yeah.
So your estimate with your new parameterization gives you something similar to what they did in global average.
Yeah, same order of magnitude. But you, for example, it's quite interesting actually. What you find is that you get much more localized high generation. So here, for example, because you're treating the topography in this different way, you get this like these very high values of generation rather than widespread, slightly lower values of generation, which means that actually the way that these waves break is slightly different, we think. So because you're getting these like very large nonlinear Lie waves in isolated locations, some of them are actually kind of breaking convectively, as opposed to this picture where it's kind of all a bit more spread out and a bit more linear. So I think the spatial pattern kind of matters, and that's what this shows you.
yeah, great.
I might be totally confused. Can you go back to your definition for the fruit number?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, yeah. So the fruit number to be much less than 1 would imply a high velocity,
Yes.
which is contrary to what you normally think.
Yeah, it's really counterintuitive, but yes.
Can you sort of explain that?
Oh, good question. It is very counterintuitive, but it's because why is it? I guess it sets the vertical wavelength of the waves. When you have a higher velocity, you have a higher vertical wavelength, which means that your topography can be taller without it going non-linear. Do you have a good like?
Isn't it the energetic argument? You have to have enough kinetic energy to lift you over the hill.
Yeah, so that's kind of what sets this argument. Yeah.
But for linear theory to work, you need that much. It's the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a similar argument.
Is this really more of a vertical fruit number? Because normally you'd use the horizontal velocity versus the horizontal wave speed.
Yeah.
Fruit number. This is a slightly different thing.
Exactly. So this is like often called like the Lie wave fruit number or the topographic fruit number, which is exactly as you say, it's a vertical wave speed versus velocity. But I find that's a bit of an opaque way to actually think about it. I think about it in terms of the ratio of vertical scales. There's actually a paper written entirely on that subject where they show that. Yeah.
What's the difference between the method you proposed versus the Lagrangian micro tracking by element one? Is it because you introduce an extra interpolation step to correct the distorted coordinate? as you showed in one of the slides?
Yeah, so I mean, the main difference is that you don't track any particles.
Oh,
So you completely do away with seeding particles, and instead you're just solving for a continuous tracer field. So it's kind of like a discrete versus continuous analog. But a lot of the same problems that you have when tracking particles and interpolating, lots of those problems remain because you don't really get anything for free. But it's like it can be easier to implement, and then there's actually a lot of different ways of doing it, different kinds of averaging you can do. You can use exponential filters, which I didn't talk about, but the implementation in Oceananigans uses exponential filters, which mean that you can find the average at all times. So you don't just find it for one reference time. You run your simulation, you find it at all times. So it's quite flexible, I would say.
okay.
Yeah.
Have you tried both methods to root out the same weight field and see if you get the same result?
That's the plan. So I think this is it helped me implemented. Like basically you can do Eulerian filtering in the same way, but you just turn off advection. But I didn't show that because it currently has a lot of numerical errors, which we're going to fix later. Yeah, so that's the plan, is to verify.
I mean, I should add that all this MOM6 stuff started last week. It's already here, so-
Don't you?
So next week, I don't know. Any more questions?
Are you going to extract vertical velocity from MOM6 for us?
If you guys can figure out how to get
We have to do-
velocity, then we'll filter it.
Any ideas?
No, actually, I have a serious question if there are no others.
Go.
So one of the potential applications of Callan's method is in understanding what we're getting out of SWOT. For those who don't know what SWOT is, it's the new satellite mission, altimetry mission, which sort of does resolve much higher resolution than the meter scale. So maybe interrupted by wave signals. So I guess I was interested to know, is that at all possible with your method, or do you need to actually be solving a full model? Can you ever apply it to some sort of observational data like SWOT?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So it's something we've thought about a bit, not necessarily even in terms of satellite data, but in terms of like experimental data.
Mm.
And I mean, my first thought is that solving PDEs on experimental or observational data sounds a bit sketchy. But these methods do seem to be quite robust in terms of, for example, like you run the to do the offline filtering, you run your PDEs forwards and then you run them backwards like you would do with particle tracking. And I didn't think I'd be able to just run them backwards without any diffusion, but it was fine. So TBD, but like maybe not. Yeah, maybe particle tracking is more robust for that because it's not going to just blow up.
Potentially put it in a SWOT data assimilating model.
Yes.
But then is outputting the grungy mean fields.
Mm.
Like that.
Yeah.
Okay, no more questions? Okay, let's thank Lois again and then.